As NBC News and others have been reporting all week, there are rumblings that the Department of Justice is preparing for the special counsel Robert Mueller to officially wrap up his Russia investigation report in the coming weeks. The speculation comes as Roger Stone appeared in court in Washington today, avoiding immediate jail time but leaving the courthouse with a gag order and a stern warning from the judge that another misstep will land him in jail. There is no third strike for him. It's 2 and out. And Michael Cohen was on Capitol Hill today as lawmakers prepare to question him again over multiple days next week. One of those will actually be in public. But if Mueller is wrapping up next week, then boy, is he in for a long weekend. To borrow the phrase from Donald Rumsfeld, there are a lot of known unknowns in the Mueller probe. In fact, the Meet the Press Daily team came up with at least 66 known unknowns just today from Mueller. Here's just a sample of the bombshells that we could get answers to sooner or later from Mueller. First off, we know the Russians interfered in the 2016 election, and they did so to help Trump get elected. But what we don't know, and what Mueller is investigating, is did members of the Trump campaign knowingly work with Russia to do that? And if so, did Mr. Trump know about it? That's obviously the big one, but there are many more. Who else will be charged? Don Jr., 2020 Trump campaign manager Brad Parscale. We don't believe either one of those gentlemen has been questioned by Mueller. And tomorrow is Friday, a typical indictment day around here. Here's another one. Who helped WikiLeaks curate and release the hacked emails in a way that inflicted maximum political damage to Hillary Clinton in each and every of the final days of the campaign? It must have been someone with deep knowledge of U.S. politics, and it's hard to imagine it was not an American. What did Mr. Trump know about the June 2016 Trump Tower meeting, and when did he know it? That's a simple one. Do the Russians have something on President Trump? How much of the Steele dossier is true? Was the president compromised by trying to build a Trump Tower in Moscow while he was also running for president? Here's another one. Could President Trump still be subpoenaed? If you recall yesterday, former U.S. Attorney Harry Litman told me on this show last night that it would make sense if you planned to subpoena the president that you would actually wait until the very last minute to do it. And perhaps above all else, why is President Trump obfuscated, attacked, and misdirected on all things related to the Mueller investigation and on Russia's interference with the 2016 campaign? We ask this question this way because why does he act like he has something to hide? Why isn't he curious about why the Russians interfered? And why isn't he curious to find out if any Americans helped them? Folks, these are the known unknowns, but as you know, there may be unknown unknowns, too. Every time new charges are brought into this investigation, we're reminded just how much more Mueller knows than any of us do. Joining me for this conversation will be former federal prosecutor and former deputy independent counsel on Ken Starr's team, Saul Weisenberg. Tonight's panel here in Washington is Bloomberg News national political reporter Sahil Kapoor, NBC News analyst Howard Fineman, and AEI vice president and NBC News contributor Danielle Pletka. Saul, let me go to you, because I color me a bit skeptical about all the reports about Mueller is close, Mueller is close. And I only say it this way. All of the reporting has been based on the Justice Department is preparing. Based on everything we don't know and haven't heard from Mueller, would it surprise you if he could actually wrap all this up and have a report early next week?
No, it wouldn't surprise me. As you pointed out, a lot of predictions about Mueller and when his report would be ready have been incorrect. We're getting more reports now than we ever have. But no, it wouldn't surprise me at all. He's done a lot of work, and he's got a, whatever else you can say about his team, he's got a highly qualified team with him.
How many of those unanswered questions that Mueller has at times in some of these filings, Saul, hinted that there's more information? How many of those questions do you think we'll get complete answers to?
Well, I think you'll get a lot of answers in Mueller's report to the AG, to Barr. The big question will be how much of that comes to the American people. Remember, Barr is the special counsel. Mueller is the special counsel. Special counsels, like independent counsels, have a special role in our system. So it's expected that he will actually file a report about what he found. But then Barr has to worry about how much of that can be released, because a lot of it's going to be 6E material, which is federal grand jury material, which under law can only be released in very limited circumstances. Some of it's going to be national security information. So I suspect that Mueller, while his report will be fulsome, he will write it in a way so that it can be released by Barr if Barr wants to do that. In a way that doesn't disclose that much 6E information. I mean, for example, if you have a person who has testified at the grand jury, you can't release that information unless you go to a court and get a court order. But if that same person was interviewed by you first outside of the grand jury, that isn't covered by Rule 6E. So there are all kinds of things that Mueller can do to make it easier for Barr, if Barr wants to, release most of the report publicly.
Sahel, what to you is the question that you think matters the most here that we've got to figure out?
Well, so firstly, the procedural question. I talked to a Democratic member of Congress who said they expect a fight with the new Attorney General, William Barr, in terms of making the report public. They do not trust him to do that. This member said that the Democrat standard is going to be that every redaction has to be justified. That's a very high standard. In terms of what they expect, Democrats are not, bracing for a letter from the president to Putin saying, "Hey, Vlad, let's collude." It's going to be much more subtle than that. The biggest thing they're looking for is something you pointed out. Is the president compromised in some way? Did Russia know something about him? Is there a financial connection? Is there a loan there? Did they know something about the president that, if they made public, would hurt the president politically, which is leverage over him, which in the Democrats' view could compromise U.S. policy?
Danny, I want to get to what you're curious about, what's a couple of the questions you'd like to see answered. But one observation I have about Bill Barr is he is bulletproof for a small period of time by Donald Trump. Donald Trump can't immediately fire another attorney general. So this debate about how, I'm curious to see if Bill Barr will use his political capital that he has in this moment.
One now has to ask what he would think the best use of that political capital is.
That's right.
And I think that's a mystery to all of us. Frankly, it was a mystery to me why Bill Barr took this job. So
I think we were on this show, and one day you're like, what is he doing?
I still don't get it, frankly. But, the problem for all of us is there's been such a swirl of innuendo. There's been such an unbelievable massive storytelling that if this doesn't come out and say that the president was colluding with the Russians and that Vladimir Putin had knowledge of Donald Trump sitting, in the Kremlin making plans
with the candlestick.
Exactly.
Sorry.
Right.
And the
Professor
conservatory.
Blum,
right. Yeah.
Exactly. That is going to be disappointing, and that everything is going to be a procedural fight rather than a substantive fight, which will end up being even more corrosive to our democratic process.
That's a concern.
Well, I think the answer to your question, what do we want to know, it's both more complex and more simple at the same time. You've laid out a brilliant series of questions here, but I think the American people, any fair-minded person, there may be 3 or 4 left in the country, they want to know what happened. They want to know. We used to say in the news magazine business, what's the tick-tock? What's the sequence of events here? You need to know who knew what when. You need to know who had what motivation. That's where things like finances and bribery and blackmail come in. You want to see the full picture. We've not seen it. I have a sense from talking to my Hill sources that you're not going to get that immediately. In other words, the reporting out of this thing, either through the mechanics of the law and or journalism and or congressional investigations, hasn't finished with this. In a way, we're maybe halfway through it, and that's what's going to be interesting about the drama of the next few weeks.
Hey, Saul, if you were given your experience with the Starr report, what lessons do you take away from that you would advise Bob Mueller either to do or not to do?
Well, first of all, the first thing he's going to do, or that Barr is going to have him do if they want to publicize any of this, is you've got to get a court order. Again, this is called 6E material, all of it that is from the grand jury. It covers matters occurring before the grand jury. We went and got a court order before we even sent it under seal to Congress. We never released it publicly. Congress did that. Same thing with Leon Jaworski. Leon Jaworski went to Judge Sirica and got an order from Judge Sirica even to release this stuff under seal to Congress. So first you got to get past that hump. But I think, in answer to your question, the broader answer is the American people do want answers. And I think Mueller wants to give them those answers consistent with his duty under law. And I think Barr does too, and I think Barr should want to, because if all Barr does is issue a summary, a very brief summary that says the president and all of his assistants and family members are exonerated, nobody is going to be satisfied with that, and they're going to doubt it, especially because how polarized we are and what people think about Barr. So I think not only will Barr try to publicize as much of the report as possible in his summary, I think he should release the actual Barr report with as few redactions as possible. He can do it. He can have Mueller go to a court and get an order releasing it. I think that's in the national interest. And by the way, one other thing, the other thing is there are a lot of people here, Chuck, who work for and with the president who may want to be publicly exonerated. If you're the president's son-in-law, you may want to have if you feel you're innocent, you may want to have that reflected in a report.
So I want to actually go deep dive into one specific question because it's at the beginning of this whole thing, and it has to do with the Mike Flynn guilty plea and what it is that he lied about, because this jumped out at us in the McCabe book. Andy McCabe describes his conversation with Michael Flynn about the Kislyak meeting, and he describes it this way. When I told him that people were curious about his conversations with Kislyak, Flynn replied, "You know what I said because you guys were probably listening." We were always listening to Kislyak is the implication. To Flynn's specific point, I had and have no comment, but I have to wonder as events played out, if you thought we were listening, why would you lie? And it's interesting, there's also a tweet that eventually got deleted from Mike Flynn's son that was basically defending his father, saying you didn't do anything wrong with this Kislyak. All of a sudden you look there and say, wait a minute, what if Mike Flynn was just taking a direct order from the commander-in-chief?
Right. Well, this gets to the question of whether there was something tangible the president was trying to hide in this process, or whether there was this political fear that this is a cloud, as he kept describing it, according to James Comey, that he simply wanted to be lifted. In other words, he just wanted it all to go away, even if there wasn't something he was trying to hide. We don't know the answer to that question, and hopefully the Mueller report will help us answer it. Now, one set of people that this is going to put on the spot to finally take a position on some of this stuff is congressional Republicans. Right. They've filibustered on weighing in on this. They've said we don't know the full picture yet. We don't know how all the pieces fit together. They view this Mueller report as putting together the pieces of the puzzle that are strewn on the table and painting that picture.
I go back to this Flynn thing, though, because Flynn had to know we were listening to Kislyak, right, Danny?
Oh, no, absolutely.
Okay, that is,
there should be no doubt about that.
There should have been no doubt. So he knows this. So they know this, so why would you? There's a blank spot we don't know here. Why would he plead guilty to lying? The Pence thinks he lies. At the same time, his son was implying that he was following on. There's a missing piece here that we don't know about this Flynn situation.
Well, isn't the suspicion that we all have about Flynn that he copped a plea on lying because he was afraid there was going to be something else? And I don't know, right? That's an unknown. Yes. Everything that we know about Flynn is that there was so much else. He was violating FARA. He was an agent for Turkey while he was in office. All of these other things that are criminal statutes. So that was always my sense of what happened.
The suspicion here also is that while the president's instincts is always to try to stifle any questions about him, that he went to really direct and forceful and extreme lengths early on. It was almost uncharacteristic of Donald Trump in the sense he was so insistent about the Flynn point. He was so concerned about Flynn that what else might there be there? Because, of course, Donald Trump casually wants to stifle any political controversy of any kind, but this went awfully far, awfully early.
It looks weirder when you look back on it. Saul, before I let you go, there has been this assumption that Donald Trump Jr., Brad Parscale in particular, are not out of the woods because Mueller never interviewed them. And the theory goes, if you haven't been interviewed by him, then you're probably a target. We found out Roger Stone indeed was a target. He got indicted. He was somebody that had never been interviewed until the indictment. Is that how we should be reading this Don Jr. situation?
Well, I don't know the full story on whether he's been interviewed or why he hasn't been interviewed, but I find it hard to believe, since what we know about Donald Trump Jr. goes to the heart of what Mueller is investigating. I find it very hard to believe that Mueller would issue a report and not have made a prosecutive decision about Donald Trump Jr. In other words, if he's going to be indicted, and I have no reason to think he is, you would have to think it would come before the report is sent over. And it looks like there's a very short window on that. And I have to say, I think a lot of people are overthinking the Mike Flynn lie, but
fair enough. Well, no, I've been worried about that myself. But when you go back after not looking at it for 2 years, you went, oh wow, there's some holes here. Anyway, Saul, thank you, sir. It's always fun to have you as a quarterback here for us. Much appreciated. Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Beat the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.